Computer. Okay, perfect. So before we kick off, whilst we're waiting for Shakir, tell me, Sophia, what's the difference between adoption, safe care, and fostering?
Adoption and what?
Safe care and fostering.
I think the difference for adoption is like for keeps forever.
Okay.
Safe care would be until the child gets placed somewhere at a or in an adoption. And foster care is a little less in power than an adoption. To me, I think safe care and foster care is one and the same, I think.
Okay. Jackie, do you have something to add there about the differences?
Yeah, the purpose of safe care is very, very temporary. It gets renewed generally around either monthly or every 3 months. And it's a very temporary solution just while they're trying to figure out the status of a child. Foster care is the purpose of foster care is potentially for reunification, to see if that is at all possible. And adoption is, as Sophia said, is permanent.
Okay. So you're both on the right track there. That is exactly right. Tell me, what is your experience with, Sophia, fostership, adoption, safekeeping? What's your experience with these three types?
It's always a nightmare.
Okay.
Because of all the
Have you had children come through for safe care, adoption, and fostering?
and
Sorry, we lost
can you hear me?
there. We lost you
And you're
completely
back.
there.
Okay, so I was saying the red tape around it all, and we understand why, because of so much abuse happening in the past, complicates the process, you know, all the red tape and all of that crap. But I think if we don't do those due diligence checks and whatnot, we'd even have bigger problems.
Okay,
So
fair
yeah,
enough.
it's all around.
Fair enough. Jackie, have you had experience with these and you'd like to share some of them?
I've done all three. And they're all massively frustrating.
Okay.
Sophia, have you done all three? Have you done safe care, foster, and adoption?
I haven't done adoption.
Okay.
Okay, so one thing to remember, the easiest way to remember it is this. The rights allocated to the carer or the parent to be is different for each three of these. The time that the child is granted and the order duration is different for all three of them also, all right? So it's an increasing right. So safekeeping is when there's usually an urgency and an investigation needs to happen to find out if the child is in need of care, all right? This is done primarily 21 days at a time, right? Up to 90 days, very rarely more than that. It needs to be renewed quite often because it is not a solution. The rights afforded to the caregiver when a child is placed under temporary safekeeping are very limited. Okay, it's very, very limited. You can basically do nothing more apart from look after the child's basic needs at the time. You cannot make a decision for them. And that's just how it goes. When it comes to fostership, you're looking at 1 year to 3 years at a time, right? And that is a more stable environment. We've discovered the child is in need of care. Now we're either going to try and finalize it through adoption, or we're going to try family reintegration, all right? In this process, the carer has, again, many more rights than temporary care, but still not complete rights. over decision making for the child. Adoption is the most complicated one, and that is permanent. And that is where the parent, the caregiver, is given full rights, full parental rights over the child. So because we are changing somebody's right, the implication of it is that it must be done very, very carefully, right? So that we do not remove somebody's rights in the process and that all parties are heard to. Okay, so that's sort of an easy way to remember it. It's temporary foster adoption. So looking at it from a social worker perspective, right? And according to the Act, Chapter 15, right? It says the purpose of adoption is to provide and nurture children by providing a safe, healthy environment and positive support. So as soon as you read that, the first thing you must think of is reporting is going to focus on the following: the nurturing of the child, the environment of the child, and support of the child, right? So any motivations for adoption will focus on those primary things in order to justify the adoption process. It has to promote the goals of permanency planning by connecting to children to other safe and nurturing family relationships intended to last a lifetime. Right, so firstly, who qualifies to be adopted? Number one, any child can be adopted if it is proven to be in the best interest of the child, if the child is adoptable, right, and we'll get into those later, and then further rules in this act. An adoption social worker must make an assessment to determine whether a child is adoptable. So this is quite important. Just because you're a social worker does not mean that you can automatically do adoptions, at least not at this time. All right. There is further training and specialization that has to happen in order to complete the adoptive process. A child is considered adoptable if the child's an orphan, right? They have no guardian, no caregiver who's willing to adopt the child. Oh, I see Shakir is coming through, right? The child has been abandoned, right? And this has to be proven through investigation by the social worker. The child's parents or guardian has abused, deliberately neglected the child, or has allowed the child to be abused or deliberately neglected to the point that they lose full parental rights over a child. All right? And the child is in need of a permanent alternative placement. Okay, so that's the one party. So number one, the easiest way to see the adoption process in terms of reporting is look at, is the child adoptable? And who can adopt the child? That's the easiest way to sort of approach it, apart from the report, which covers the three things we discussed earlier. All right, so a person who can adopt a child. So we know that the child is now adoptable. Who can adopt this child? Number one, a child can be adopted jointly by a husband and a wife. All right, so if you already can prove that you're married, you're good. If it's partners in a permanent domestic life partnership, you can also apply for adoption. Other persons sharing a common household forming a permanent family unit. This is very rare, but it is allowable. You can be adopted by a widow, a divorced, or an unmarried person. By a married person whose spouse is the parent of the child, or by a person whose permanent domestic life partner is the parent of the child. All right, so if you get married and you want them to adopt your child, they can do that, even if not. By the biological father of the child, born out of wedlock, or by the foster parent of the child. Right, so if they qualify for that, which basically almost anything, all right, what must the social worker look for? So the report that you're going to do first covers the child, what makes the child adoptable. Second covers who's going to adopt the child, right? And then we start looking at the following. Number one, is the person fit and proper to be entrusted with full parental responsibilities and rights in respect of the child? Jackie, how would a social worker go about investigating this? What documents would they ask for the person to provide in order to investigate this? Okay, Shakir, I see you've joined us.
Good evening.
Sorry, I didn't know I was muted.
Okay, perfect. So, Jackie, tell us again. Sorry, Shakira, I'll come back to you right now. What documents are available to prove that a person is fit and proper?
Sorry, can I just ask a question first?
Yeah.
Just because I can't actually see the document right now. Is there an age restriction on the person who may adopt a child? I mean, is it like 18 to 60 or something?
Well, they have to
Because
be
you
an
haven't
adult.
mentioned that. So they have
No,
to be an
there's no
adult.
age
That's
restriction.
all.
They have to be an adult.
Okay. Okay.
So
So,
that's
but
be over the
and
age of 18.
there isn't an official cutoff date according to the Children's Act.
No, there's no official cutoff age, but the cutoff age you'll see will be enforced as we go to point B. So point A is they must be fit and proper to be entrusted with the right and respect for child. What documents would we look for? Shakira, I'm going to ask you the same question so you can start thinking a bit ahead.
Okay, so the kind of documents I would look for would be, I would look for references from people who know the person well. I would look for proof of employment to prove that they're financially stable, and some kind of financial proof that they have at least some sort of adequate income to provide for the child. I would look for medical reports to make sure that there's no major medical. If there is any mental illness, I would ask for like a psychological report on the person. Yeah. Things like marriage certificates, proof of residence, all the basics of proving you're an actual person and you exist, proof of employment, stuff like that.
Okay, perfect. Shakira, what could we add to that? Sophia, what could we add?
I've thought of two more.
Yeah, go ahead whilst we wait.
Police clearance and the Form 30s to make sure that they're not criminals.
Okay, so police clearance, Form 30. Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute.
No worries.
You did the same I did.
And she stole the same thing that I.
The Form 30 is for employees and employers. This one is
Form 7.
Form 7, yeah.
Yeah.
Form 30 is to make sure you haven't been involved in any sex crimes.
Child offenders.
Yes, the child sex offenders list.
Okay, what other documents would you use?
Documents to say that you can look after the child financially. You're fit. You don't have any criminal record. But I'm sure criminals can also shame men. Those who serve their time, I'm sure they can. Anyway.
Well, once they've had it expired from their record.
Once they've
had it expunged from the record. Once you've served time and after enough time has passed, you can have it removed from your record and then you're good to go. It won't appear anymore.
Okay, so what are we missing out?
No, I think you guys have pretty much covered it in terms of the basic documents that you would, right? Point B says they must be willing and able to undertake, exercise, and maintain those rights and responsibilities. So this is where the age thing comes into play, right? Number one, there's the willingness of the person. So willingness is determined via an affidavit that is done by the adopter as such, right? In which they say, this is how I can exercise these parental rights and maintain them, right? And this is when you'd rule out somebody who's, let's say, 75, right? As you as a social worker could possibly motivate that they couldn't keep up with it. That's up to your discretion. Then it's over the age of 18 years, right? And properly assessed by adoption social worker for compliance to paragraph A and B. So your report, your first report, there's a set of reports that you will give. The first one is on the child. The second one is on the adopter, right? And both of these take an investigation, right? So there's a few things that we need to consider. Number one, A person may not be disqualified from adopting a child on virtue of his or her financial status. Right? So that alone cannot be used to prevent an adoption. A person who adopts a child may apply for means test social assistance where accepted. Right? A person unsuitable to work with children is not a fit and proper person to adopt a child. All right. So if you're on the child sex offenders register, then you cannot adopt a child. The biological father of a child who does not have guardianship in respect of the child, or the foster parent of the child, has the right to be considered as a prospective adoptive parent when the child becomes available for adoption. A person referred to in Section A must be regarded as having elected not to apply for the adoption, of the child if that person fails to apply for the adoption of the child within 30 days after a notice calling on that person to do so have been served on him or her by the sheriff. So basically what it means is, when you have a foster child, or if you are the father of a child, right, and the child is now up for adoption, you can say, I will adopt the child. Right? I want those full rights given to me as a child. You have 30 days to do this from when the order is issued by the sheriff that invites you to apply for it. So you're the social worker. Who is the first person that you are going to invite to apply to be the adoptive parent? It's going to be the father of the child or the foster parents of the child. A family member of a child who prior to the adoption has given notice to the clerk of the children's court that he or she is interested in adopting the child has the right to be considered as a prospective adoptive parent when the child becomes available for adoption. So this is how it goes. Number one, father of the child gets invited. Number two, family gets invited. Number three, foster parents get invited. Number four, it's then open overall. Of course, it doesn't mean that you cannot open it to more than one at the same time, but they do have the right to be considered prospectively. All right, and it will slant their way. Are we all up to scratch on 232? 231.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So a register must be kept of adoptable children and prospective adoptive parents. All right, this is kept through the Directors General, right? And they keep a record of part one, the children that are up for adoption in the country, and part two, people who are fit and proper to be adoptive parents. Right? It
How does a
contains
child
all...
become available for adoption?
Okay, so if we go back up, we'll see a child can be adopted if the child's an orphan, if they have no guardian or caregiver who is willing to look after the child or adopt the child, right? If the whereabouts of the child's parents or guardian cannot be established, if the child has been abandoned, right? If the child's guardian has abused, neglected the child, and allowed the child to be abused or neglected. Or if the child is already in need of alternative permanent placement. So if they're already within the system.
Okay, I have a question based on that. Right?
Yeah.
Real life story. In my family, my cousin, two cousins actually, different families, were given up for adoption within the family. Is that legal?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time? The two cousins were?
Let's just take one, right? One cousin.
Mm-hmm.
She was given in adoption to another family member.
Yeah.
Is that fine?
Yes. Yeah, so look at the order of adoption again. Biological father, family, foster parents, then rest. Right, so they would be in category 2.
Okay.
Right, so the goal would always be to place the child within a family in which they are biologically linked to. That's a preference is always given that way, so it makes complete sense. All right, so a register is kept. This register has all the information of the child on it, right? And the child's details, of course, removed once the child has been adopted. Now, a prospective adoptive parent can have their names on the respective list if they're a citizen or permanent resident of the Republic, and they've complied with all the above, right? So they are fit and proper, they're over the age of 18, so on and so forth. So once you register, so let's say you decide, I want to be on the register for people who are willing to adopt a child. Number one, that registration is valid for a period of 3 years, right? And it can be renewed as it's prescribed. It ceases when you die, when you give written notice to take you off the list, right? Or if the department or the Director General discovers that you're no longer a fit and proper person, or you're no longer willing to take on these responsibilities. If you leave the country, right? If you have a child already with you that is removed from care from you because of abuse, you are taken off the list. And if the person is registered criminal, convicted of an offense involving violence, right? And that's quite important to note there. Only the Director General and a few select people have access to the people on the list and the children on the list for adoption. All right. They can grant this to child protection organizations as and when it's done. All right, as and when that information is needed, but it's only them that should have access to it. How is consent adjudicated? Number one, a child may be adopted only if consent has been given by each parent of the child, regardless whether the parents are married or provided that if the parent of a child, that parent is assisted by his or her guardian. Right? So if the child is a child parent, then their guardian has to assist them in giving consent. Right? Consent can be given by any person who holds guardianship in respect of the child. Right? And the child's consent themselves has to be given if they are 10 years or older. If the child is under 10, but as of an age, maturity, and stage, where they can understand the implications of such consent. All right, so a whole section of your report would be the child interview and the child giving consent or their guardians giving consent. Both parents have to consent to an adoption for it to happen. All right, subsection 1.
Okay. Can I comment on this? Because I think this is crazy. So looking into sort of pregnancy crisis, which is a stuff that I'm getting involved in, part of one of the high reasons for child abandonment is the fact that a teenager under the age of 18 may not consent to an adoption without parental consent.
Yes.
So a teenager may, without parental consent, have an abortion, but they may not safely hand a child over for adoption without parental consent, which means a child in the hospital who has given birth but does not wish her parents to know about it may not sign the child off for adoption. And so generally speaking, we'd rather take the child and then abandon it. So I actually think that this is not a good law.
There is a reasoning behind it, and it's an uncomfortable reason for some people. But the reasoning is on when do your rights begin? When are you a person, right? Before birth, strictly speaking by law, you are not a person, right? You have none of those rights are allocated to you before birth. Therefore, the rules of abortion are slightly different from the rules of adoption. Once you are born, now you have a voice, you have these rights that we are about to change, and therefore we need consent to do that. All right, so that's sort of the reasoning behind that. I've explained it very basically. It is more complicated than that.
I get that, but I just think it's not well thought through, because what it does is just drive up child abandonment.
Yeah. So,
but I mean, there's a lot of bad laws around that. So, yeah.
No, it does, and it puts people in very difficult situations. And I think we need to consider that the law works for the majority of cases. It is not meant to work for each and every small deviation from the norm, which is also a tough realization to come to, but it caters to the majority. And the in-betweens are done through special orders of the court. All right. So if a parent of a child wishes the child to be adopted by a specific person, they need to state the name of that person when they give consent. Consent is given through an affidavit, through interviews, and it's repeated in person before the children's court officer. All right. Before consent of the child is granted, right, the adoption worker must counsel the parents of the child, right, and when applicable, the child on the decision for the child to be made available to adoption. So there's a whole process that happens before consent is given, in which they're explained what will happen, what it means, what the implications are, and how they are impacted. Okay. Right, we're going to skip through that because that's just how it is done. Post-adoptive agreements. All right. Oh, also, you have 60 days in which you can remove your consent for adoption, right? After 60 days, that consent is considered final, and then it's a different court order to have that removed. So post-adoptive agreements. A parent or guardian of a child may, before they apply for the adoption of a child, enter into a post-adoptive agreement with a prospective adoptive parent of that child. And that can include things such as communication, updates, including visitation between the child and the parent or guardian, right? It could include access to information such as medical information. And this is all granted to them after the adoption has taken place. So this is one of the things that they are counseled on before the adoptive procedure takes place. The adoption cannot proceed if the child is at the age of maturity and stage of development and understands the implications and does not consent. The adoptive social worker facilitating the adoption must then assist the parties in preparing a post-adoption agreement and then have to read through that agreement very carefully and highlight issues that could arise from this agreement and what the implications are and how it is going to be finalized. There is a format in which the post-adoption agreement takes place, and we will complete it in one of our classes in, sorry, just some water. Right, and that is submitted to the court to make final. It only takes place once it is made an order of court, and it can only be changed by an order of court. Okay, let's stop there for a second. Let's recap. Shakir, you with us?
Yes.
Tell me, what makes a person adoptable? How do we determine if somebody's adoptable?
The person is an orphan.
Okay. Another one?
That's one. In need of care. The child is neglected. The circumstances surrounding is not good for the child. The parents are abusive or things like that.
And the child has been found in need for permanency. Yep, you're right. You're right on there. Great. Safia, what determines whether a person can be on the other side of the register, whether they can adopt? So you have the child that's adoptable. How do you know that the parents have the, or this person has the right to adopt? What are you looking
for? If all the checks and balances are in place.
Lovely. I love that vague answer. It's so stunning. Can you give me a bit more?
Yeah, they must get clearance from the offenders list. They must have probably a clear criminal record. Never
They must
involved
be
in
fit
violence.
and proper. Yes.
Yeah, and it doesn't depend on the person's marital status or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
They must be over the age of 18.
الأقرب فالأقرب.
Say again?
They must be over the age of 18.
Yeah.
Okay. And most importantly, they must consent to the adoption. Okay. Jackie, how is consent dealt with by the social worker? What's the process of obtaining consent?
With regards to the parents or with regards to the child?
The whole process.
Okay. So a person giving a child up for adoption needs to be counseled regarding all the implications of the adoption. Also, they need to be advised about whether it's a closed or an open adoption, whether there's a post-adoption agreement, and they need to then sign consent with the social worker regarding the giving up of the child. Those who are wanting to adopt a child must sign an affidavit to say they are willing to take care of this child. Again, that comes through counseling to ensure that that is actually the case. And a child who's over the age of 10 must also consent, or if, you know, if they slightly younger than that but have full understanding of the process, they must then also give consent, and they are counseled as well by the social worker to understand full consent. Also, if there's a post-adoptive agreement with an older child, they must also consent to the post-adoptive agreement to make sure that they understand all the implications of it. They must also then sign consent for that, and consent, they can change their mind in 60 days. Thereafter, it is binding and would need another court thingy to change it.
And which parents can give consent?
So both parents must consent. And if the parent of the child is under the age of 18, their legal guardian, parents, whatever, must consent on their behalf.
Okay, perfect. So a freeing order is the next thing. So a freeing order is a type of relief that is provided to the parents of the child that allows them to be free from their responsibilities of providing financially for the child whilst the child is awaiting adoption. All right, so it frees them of their parental responsibilities. Sorry, not just financial, but frees them of their parental responsibilities pending the adoption of the child. All right, so number one, we need consent of the person to be freed from their duties and responsibilities. And this person must then authorize a child protective organization to provide adoptive services to a parent to exercise parental responsibilities and rights and respect for the child, right? So the child's rights aren't just left in the lurch. There needs to be a handover of these rights temporarily through the freeing order, right? By the parents, fully consenting parents. So when does this order lapse? Number one, if the child has not been adopted within 12 months, the freeing order lapses and you have full responsibility of your child again, or if there's no reasonable prospects that the child will be adopted. All right, so we have a bit of an older in the system and there's no chance they're going to be adopted. The parental rights kick back in. Or if the order is terminated by the court on the ground that it is no longer in the interests of the child, the best interest of the child, or if the person who consented to the adoption withdraws their consent. These orders are not just blanket orders, right? These orders are very nuanced in some cases. They will stipulate what rights and what responsibilities you are freed from for the period of 12 months.
I'm so sorry, I'm not fully understanding. Who gets a freeing order? And
the
what is
freeing
it?
order is given to the parents who are putting up their child for adoption.
Okay.
Right. So if I have a child and I'm going to put them up for adoption, I can get a freeing order, and that frees me from my duties as the parent of the child, right, for a period of 12 months, and hands those duties over to a child protective organization.
Oh, okay. So like the child is placed in like temporary safe care.
In a fostership.
in that, yes. Okay.
in a fostership. So I'm giving up some of my rights so that they can proceed on with it. That means I'm not paying maintenance for the child. I'm not responsible for the child's day-to-day food and care and all of that. That's given to somebody else for a period of 12 months.
Okay.
So the purpose of that is so that the child can get adopted. But then if the child doesn't get adopted, then the parents have to take the rights back.
Well, yes, you cannot give up your rights as a parent until it's finalized fully, which is why the freeing order is given for a short period of 1 year. Right, so if the child cannot be adopted in that
okay.
time, you are then responsible for the care of that child again.
Okay.
Otherwise, you
So
just have a whole load of children.
okay. So one
Can
of
you
my kids,
reapply?
for example, sorry,
Mhm.
so just one of our kids, for example, the parents wish to sign off on her.
Mhm.
And we were approached, literally sitting in the court, saying they may not sign off their rights unless there's someone willing to adopt her. Are you willing to adopt her? Was like
Yes.
literally like on the thing. So parents can't sign off their parental rights unless there's someone willing to adopt her, or so adopt
Somebody
them.
has to take on those rights. Those rights cannot be
Okay.
left unaccounted for.
Okay. And so in that situation, let's say the parents wanted to sign her off, but I said no, we don't want to adopt her,
Then she wouldn't be. They
then
wouldn't be free.
then so then they could apply for a freeing order for a year.
Yes, but then it would go
In the
to an
hope-
organization.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. It's just I've never heard that before.
So
it's new.
what they would be applying for you would be a freeing order pending the finalization of the adoption.
Okay.
Right? And if not with you, then it would go to an organization because that order puts the child as a ward of state, sorry, and
Okay.
allows the state to then allocate the care which the parents would have allocated to the child.
How is that different to simply putting a child into safe care or into fostership?
So for safe care, the parental rights of the child are not limited. Right? You still have full responsibilities towards the child who is in safe care. You still have to maintain them. You can still be sued for maintenance. You're still at
Really?
risk. Yes, because you have
That
not
is
lost
so
your
weird.
parental rights, right? Parental
What?
rights are not removed apart from parental rights are not removed and responsibilities are not removed until adoption is finalized.
So I could sue parents for like maintenance
They could
while
be
the
sued
kids
for
are in
maintenance.
foster care.
100%, because
Oh my
they are
word.
still the primary responsible person. In practice,
No way.
we don't sue, but they
No.
are still in care. And strictly speaking, even within fostership, the parent still has a say on the schooling of the child, the medical health of the child. So if the child gets rushed to hospital, strictly speaking, the parent, unless there's been an adoptive order, has to be spoken to, and they need to give consent to medical treatments. Their rights have not changed.
Hectic bananas. Okay.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So
then what are they free from?
They are free from their responsibilities as the parent of the child.
So what if they still have to pay maintenance and whatever?
No, they don't. They don't. Not for that period of 12 months.
So can you reapply after 12 months?
Yes, you can reapply after 12 months, but generally, if you haven't been adopted by 12 months, then it's not looking great. But yes, you can reapply after 12 months.
Sure.
Right,
Okay.
but it cannot be, so a freeing order cannot be used in like forever. It cannot be used for, there is a strict limitation to it. Right, so after 12 months, you'd have to have a very diligent magistrate look at it and offer it to you. Because remember, where's this done? This is done in the children's court, and the children's court does not have the right to change a person's basic human rights. Only the High Court or above can do that. right? So we need to keep in mind where it goes and where in the court structure you are.
Okay.
All right, we're all together? Good. So when is consent not required? The consent of a parent, so the person giving up the child, is not required if they are incompetent due to mental illness, if they have abandoned the child, or if the whereabouts of the parent cannot be established. Sorry. And very importantly, if the identity of the guardian is unknown or the identity of the parent is unknown, then consent is not required. If the parent has abused or deliberately neglected the child and has been found guilty thereof, right, then their consent is not generally required because they've lost that ability. That right will be taken away from them within that process of being found guilty of abuse, right? If you have consistently failed, and this is never used, to fulfill your parental responsibilities during the last 12 months, the social worker can apply for a special order to make your consent not applicable. If you have been divested by an order of the court of the right to consent to the adoption of the child, so if the court has taken away that right of yours, then of course we don't have to give consent. Or, and this is very often the case, unlike the above two, which aren't, you have failed to respond to a notice of the adoption within 30 days of receiving that notice. All right, so then the consent lapses. It is not required from the child if the child's an orphan, has no guardian or caregiver who is willing and able to adopt the child. Right? Or if the court is provided with certified copies of the child's parents' death certificate. Right? Then, of course, who's going to consent for the child? All right, remember we are referring to the child as under 10. If the parent is the biological father of the child, right? So the consent is not necessary if he's not married to the mother's child, was not married to her at the time of conception, or any time thereafter, has not acknowledged that he's the biological father of the child, right? So spending too much time with the child, buying them school lunches, don't do that, right? If the child was conceived from an incestuous relationship between the biological father and the mother, then consent is not required from the father, right? Or the court, after the mom accuses the dad of rape and they find that on the balance of probabilities, the child was a result of rape, right? Then consent is not required. Right. Are we all together there?
So it's an interesting thing. We were told right up front before we adopted our first child that it's like a known thing that mothers will write on the forms when they are filling in forms for adoption that the father has died. And, yes. Just so that this is not required. And we were like, yeah. I can tell you, like almost every form I've ever seen talks about the father passing away. Yes. Like it's just a thing. They just all write it down. And it's hilarious because sometimes the child is born in 2020, but the father passed away in 2016. It's miraculous.
So consent is not required. Consent is not required from the dead. And that's usually the easiest way people.
And so that's what they do.
Mm-hmm. So if the person who is going to adopt the child claims that they are the biological father of the child, right? And therefore their consent is needed, right? This is how they prove it. Number one, they have to give written acknowledgement that they are the biological father of the child, right? Either to the mother or the clerk of the children's court before the child reaches the age of 6 months old. If they've paid maintenance towards the child, if they've paid damages in terms of customary law, right? Or if he has, rather foolishly, allowed his name to be linked to the registration of the birth of the child when the birth is registered. Right? So if it doesn't say unknown under father and it's got your name, then you have to give consent. right? The court, though, is given the ability to work on a balance of probabilities, right, in order to decide on the existence of these parents and the rights given to them. Okay, now we've got all the layouts. We know who's being adopted, how we're going to do it, who qualifies, who doesn't qualify. We have all the consent. And now we start looking at what information is gathered for the proposed adoption. So when a child becomes available for adoption, so they have now gone through the process and they were deemed available for adoption, right? The clerk of the court must take steps to establish the name and address of each person for whose consent the adoption is required, right? So they will have it listed in the child's file, all the people that need to give consent for the adoption of the child. Then the person who has consented for the adoption of the child must submit a statement to that effect to the clerk of the court, right? This is done through the social worker. So you would be collecting all these statements and submitting them to the clerk of the court to be added to the file, right? They will then also request the Home Affairs to disclose any information containing the registration of the birth of a child, including the identities and particulars of the person who has acknowledged being the father or the mother of the child. What this basically means is, if you need to summarize it, a child cannot be adopted out without a birth certificate. Okay, the birth certificate must be there, and those people, at a very minimum, must be the ones to consent to it. Right? If a social worker involved in the proposed adoption obtains information regarding the identity and whereabouts of the person that needs to give consent, they must without delay report this and report that consent, if they get it, to the clerk of the children's court. Okay, so this process is usually what takes the longest. Ads will go out informing the general public, people will be invited. It's a whole lot of work done in the initial steps to gain consent from all the right parties, because we're about to remove someone's rights. Okay, so what
And
notice
can I tell you
is
how
given?
crazy
Yes.
it is? You're probably just about to say is we have to advertise in the classified section of a newspaper for the person to come forward.
Yes.
You advertise randomly on one day in the middle of nowhere, and you expect that that person will be reading the classifieds of the Sowetan newspaper on that particular day, looking for their name, because that's normal.
Yes, so you have to make it publicly available, and that's the
That's
easiest
ridiculous.
way to cross that bridge.
No, really, and it costs
even buy
so much
newspaper?
money.
Aren't they doing away with
Exactly.
newspapers?
I know, but it literally is, that is what is required. And they have 90 days from the advert that you put out.
Okay,
So you have to put the advert out in the advert saying, would so-and-so please contact social worker so-and-so with their phone number regarding the adoption of their child so-and-so, born either a name or born on this date.
Yeah.
And it's this tiny little square in the classified section, which ridiculously costs so much money. And then they have 90 days from that point. And then you have to, as the adoptive parent, buy that newspaper and keep the original newspaper to prove that you have advertised 90 days ago for that parent to randomly, magically see it and contact the social worker.
Exactly that. Sorry, Shakir, you're
Not
going to ask a
ridiculous
question.
at all.
What happens when children were just abandoned, like in the movies, at the church or at the children's home, etc.? And there's no way of getting the birth name or whatever the case is. What do we do in that case?
So what I have seen in the past is they would publish to say that there was a child found, and can those people please come forward to give consent for adoption?
Same
They
newspaper story.
supposedly, same newspaper story, but they also are supposed to do an investigation to see if they can find out who dumped it. So they're supposed to go and literally do detective work in the community to see if they can find out. It's never done. And so these children often sit in children's homes for years because nobody's done the investigation. So the child is not yet deemed available for adoption.
Because we cannot pull the certificate out because we don't know where the child is. Right.
Yeah.
Of course, if it's a baby, it's a lot. But if it's a child that's already been around for some time, it's a bit more difficult.
Even with a
Have any-
baby, it's an absolute nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. So many of the babies who are sitting in children's homes in places of safety are because social workers have not done the investigation that have then made the child officially abandoned and available for adoption.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Sophia, do you have something to add there?
No, I hate the system. It's nothing new.
All right. So you as a social worker, once the child has been deemed as, okay, we're going to put this child up for adoption, we've gone to the court. You as a social worker will go to the court to get the order, right, delivered by the sheriff of the court, ordering people to either give consent or deny consent. The notice that is served on them will say that we're planning on adopting out this child, right? And you have to consent or not consent to this, and you have 30 days in which to do this. All right, so that's step one of the paperwork. Step two, sorry. Step one is all the people that need to give consent are noted. Step two, a notice goes out saying you need to give consent. And after 30 days, if they can prove that you have received the notice and you have not replied, then your consent is granted as given. All right. Then we get to now the application. So all of this is pre-work. This is just preparing the child for the adoption. Now we're getting into it. Number one, the adoption application must be made to a children's court, and there's a prescribed format in which it goes. All right. There will be a report again that is done in a prescribed format, and that will give you the details of the child, whether the adoption is in the best interest of the child, all medical information in relation to the child, and then assessments that you have carried out on the child, right? So be the health assessment, the mental health assessment, the scholastic assessment, assessment on the family circle, assessment in terms of people giving consent, and then a letter by the provincial head of social development recommending the adoption of the child, right? So you will then go to the DSD first, get that letter to say, look, I've done all these steps. Can the head of the DSD consent to the adoption? They will give you a filled out letter, which you then take to your application, right? This is then taken to the clerk of the court. The clerk of the court then compiles the file, and the file is the consent for the adoption, any information that they've established in the lead up to this adoption. So how we compile the list, the notices we have put out, any written responses that have come back from the public. Maybe the parents have asked for a specific post-adoptive process to happen. All the proof that the notices were issued, right? Every notice that is not issued to must have a report attached to it to say, yeah, we've tried, they did not reply. And then all the social worker reports must be attached, right? No one else has access to these documents apart from a person actively involved in the case. So now it's come forward. They've said, we've discovered the child is up for adoption. We have made the list. We have sent the notice. The notices have come back and 30 days has passed. Now we're going to go back to the court and say, now can we consider an adoption application? Do you see what's happening there? It's taking a fair amount of time, right? This is not a rushed process because it is a very intricate and detailed process, so we cannot rush it. Once the court has all of this, then we consider whether the application for adoption will continue, right? Now the court gets more detailed. Now we start looking at what is the cultural and religious background of the child, the parent's child, the child's parents, and the prospective adoptive parents. All right, so we look at the culture, the religious backgrounds, the general backgrounds of all three of these parties. Then, what reasonable preferences have been expressed in the consent right? So when they gave consent, did they give conditions to the consent? Did they make requests? We consider that. And then the social worker report. Then then the court can issue an order for the adoption of the child. The court has to, number one, and this is the breakdown of your report again, the adoption is in the best interest of the child. The prospective parent complies with section 231, which is, are they over 18? Are they fit and proper? Do they have the ability to look after? But no consent has been withdrawn and all consent has been given, right? Then we are good to go and public notice has been given. Okay, so let's recap a little bit before we look at withholding consent and what is implied in there. All right, let's go. Jackie, what type of conditions could a person give when they are giving consent? What type of conditions can they put in there when they're giving consent?
Sorry, I don't quite understand.
So when I go to, let's say I want to adopt this child, Timothy. His parents have to give consent to the adoption. The consent does not have to be blanket consent. They can put certain requests in with the consent. What type of requests are those usually?
They can put a request for a specific person, which they then need to swear before a court. They can consent to a adoption with a post-adoption agreement. Or they can give blanket consent. Yeah,
that's pretty much it.
That's it.
All right. Safia, tell me, when is consent not required from the parent?
When they did?
Okay, when they did, that is the big one. Thank you, Shakir. But what else could disqualify you from having to give consent?
I think maybe they're underage or mentally ill.
If you're making your own brothers and sisters and the child was born out of wedlock. And one more condition. When something has happened that caused this child to come about.
Incest.
Incest, yes. But there's also another one.
Rape.
Rape. There we are. Okay. Now, Shakir. There are 3 big steps that are followed before the order for adoption can go through. Step 1 is we make sure that the child is adoptable, right? Step 2 is what? What is the most important thing in preparation for it?
Sure. Is it not the newspaper one?
Yes, it's part of that. It's part of that. Yes, but there's a big over. It's a word that starts with a C and ends in an onsen.
The child's consent.
Okay. Who all is seeking consent? Whose all consent do we need to have, and how do we go about getting it?
Obviously. Yeah. Just 1 second. I'm cramping.
No, I like the time buying technique.
No, I just finished gymming, so I'm cramping. Who's all consent that we need? We need the parents' consent, obviously, if they are there. The court's consent, and the person that is going to adopt, the adoptee. Adopter, at least.
And how long do you have to give that consent?
30
how many
days.
do you have? 30 days. Okay. Perfect.
Is it correct?
That is correct. 100%. So once all of this is compiled, we've now got all the consents, we've got all the paperwork ready to go. We go to the court, and Jackie, what will the court investigate? Now they start looking more deeply into the case, and what are they looking for specifically?
Now they start looking into, so obviously check all the reports and their consent, and they start compiling a file, and then they start looking into the religious and cultural background of the child's parents and the adoptive parents. I think the medical needs, was that one of them? I know there's religious and cultural. I think there was medical, and there was something else which I can't remember.
Okay. And then
Best interest of the child.
There we are. Okay, so that's where we will go
preferences of the parent.
That's where we'll go to today, right? So the preference of the parent are then considered in the stage, because that will form part of the order. Last question quickly. Let's go, Sophia. Explain a freeing order for me.
A what?
A freeing order.
Is that the one where a certain amount of time is lapsed and the person is removed from the protection register stuff?
No. No. Shakir, try.
Where the person is now, the responsibilities are taken away from the person. He doesn't have to pay maintenance for up to 12 months.
Yes, the parental responsibilities are alleviated from the parent for a period of 12 months. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so we're going to stop there today, right? Because next week we need to go into what is unreasonable withholding of consent, and how does the order itself look, and how can the order be changed, right? So once the adoption has taken place, what if we decide we want to rescind the adoption? What is the process for that? Then we might even touch on inter-country adoption, but I don't think we're there yet. I think it's still quite a while away from it. All right, are there any questions, any misunderstandings on this section that we need to clarify? Are we all good? Could you guys all go do a report? If you were asked to today, would you know what to look for?
Can we have the form?
No, you cannot have the form yet, because first we need to go through unreasonable consent. And then we will do the form as a case study.
Cool.
Okay, so I think that's going to be it. I'm going to wrap it up over there. Thank you guys very much, and I will see you guys next week for the next section.
Thank you.
Cool beans.
Right, bye.
Good night.
Right.